Our dumb boy rushed up the apartment stairs, focused entirely on the pressing need to find a bathroom. He fumbled with his keys at the door, but his progress was suddenly halted by a series of loud and sussy noises echoing through the hallway. He realized, with a sinking heart, that his landlord, Mr. Yu, was once again doing cardio with his frequent visitor from the coffee shop, without any regard for the thinness of the walls. Inside the unit, the landlord and the blonde woman were completely immersed in a cardio session, showing a total lack of concern for anyone who might be listening. The landlord even went as far as to suggest that if any of his tenants had a problem with the constant disturbances, they were more than welcome to pack their bags and move elsewhere. Standing alone in the corridor, the young man felt a wave of embarrassment and frustration wash over him as he tried to block out the sounds of their indifferent behavior. The following morning in the classroom, the history lecture took an unexpectedly personal turn for him as the teacher began discussing the behavior of plantation owners in the early 1900s. The instructor explained how those in power viewed their workers as little more than animals, often walking among them in states of no clothes because they felt no shame in front of people they considered inferior. This historical lesson hit home for the protagonist, who sat at his desk, imagining his landlord's guest as one of those entitled figures looking down on everyone else. He began to realize that the lack of privacy in his building wasn't just an accident, but a sign that the owner truly didn't see the tenants as human beings, worthy of respect. This thought lingered in his mind as he looked around the room, feeling more like a frustrated observer than a student. Once the bell rang, he decided it was time to speak up and sought out Darla, who was currently laughing and talking with a popular student named Tae. Darla and the protagonist had been close since they were children, and their families were so intertwined that they were practically like siblings. He managed to pull her aside into the hallway to discuss the growing problem at the apartment building, hoping she might understand his perspective. He tentatively suggested that her father's behavior was starting to resemble the cold indifference of the plantation owners from their history lesson. He explained how uncomfortable it was to hear everything happening in the neighboring unit every single day, especially since the landlord made no effort to be discreet. Darla did not react with the sympathy he was hoping for, instead becoming deeply offended that he would speak about her father in such a negative light. She delivered a sharp slap to his face and argued that the thin walls were simply a reality of the building that her father couldn't change. When the conversation shifted to her own habit of preparing clothes in front of him without a second thought, she dismissed his concerns by saying they were like family, and there was no reason to feel awkward. The tension between them peaked just as Tae and his group of friends arrived, having grown jealous of the private conversation. Without a word of warning, Tae delivered a heavy kick that sent the young man sprawling onto the floor while the group laughed at his misfortune. They mocked him for being a mere tenant who didn't know his place, leaving him humiliated and more aware than ever of the social divide between them. The young man remained curled on the hallway floor as the group of students gathered around to enjoy his misery. Tae stood over him and wanted to know exactly what had been said to cause such a scene. Rather than revealing their actual conversation, Darla decided to get creative with the truth by claiming he was merely begging for her help because her father was planning to raise the rent next month. The protagonist looked on in disbelief as his real frustrations were transformed into a story of him pleading for financial mercy. The group of bullies found this absolutely hilarious and mocked him for being such a hopeless case, noting that it was no wonder Darla didn't consider him a real friend. As they turned to leave, one of the boys suggested that evicting him and his family might be the easiest way to solve the problem. Darla played along with the joke, suggesting that her father was simply too soft-hearted to kick them out. Even as she walked away with her arm around Tae, she cast a lingering look back at the young man on the floor with an expression that was both smug and strangely intense. This look stayed with him long after they had vanished from sight, leaving him more confused than ever about where they stood. The sting of the school day eventually gave way to the quiet of the evening as the young man arrived back at the apartment building. He was surprised to find Darla waiting outside his door, leaning against the brick wall and looking far more relaxed than she had earlier. She wondered what had taken him so long, and if he was still holding a grudge about the incident in the hallway. Feeling a bit cornered, he apologized for the things he had said about her father, hoping to smooth things over. Darla seemed to brush off the apology with a smile and immediately began asking about his mother's work schedule. He realized she was trying to figure out exactly how much time they had alone, so he mentioned that his mother usually wouldn't be home until 9 when working overtime. A sussy look crossed Darla's face as she realized they had plenty of time to themselves. She suggested they find something entertaining to do to pass the hours until 10 minutes before 9. Junie and Darla made their way inside the apartment, kicking off their shoes with the ease of people who had been doing this for years. He mentioned that his father was busy with work for the day, which made the place feel unusually quiet for once. Darla led the way into his bedroom, and he made sure to secure the door behind them to avoid any sudden interruptions from neighbors or family. As she settled into his desk chair, she brought up the humiliating display from earlier at school and admitted that the whole ordeal must have felt quite miserable for him. Junie tried to maintain his dignity by brushing it off and claiming that he did not feel bad at all and actually deserved the treatment for speaking poorly about her father. Darla simply smiled at his attempt to be stoic, finding his loyalty to their shared past rather endearing despite the chaos of the day. The atmosphere in the room shifted as Darla leaned in. She explained that her harsh behavior at school was actually a necessary act to keep her partner from getting even more sussy of their close bond. In her view, acting like his enemy in public was the only way to protect him from a much worse confrontation with the popular crowd. She whispered that despite how things looked in the hallway, there were certain sides of her personality that only he was allowed to see. She then instructed him to lie down on the floor, and Junie complied without hesitation, though his heart thundered against his chest like a trapped bird. She looked down at him with a sussy grin and told him he had been such a good boy that he deserved a special cardio reward for his patience. While things were getting complicated in Junie's room, a very similar scene of indifference was unfolding right next door in Mr. Yu's apartment. The heat of the evening was becoming unbearable, and the landlord and his frequent visitor were busy complaining about the stuffy air while making as much noise as possible while doing cardio practice. Their distraction was interrupted when the woman spotted a small yellow note that Darla had left pinned to the door earlier that afternoon. The message was full of cheeky remarks about her father's tireless work ethic and his choice in constant company. Mr. Yu found the note absolutely charming and decided that his daughter was just as eccentric and bold as he was. He took the note as a sign of her daughterly support and settled back in for more loud behavior, convinced that he was an excellent father who truly understood the spirit of his child. Back in the bedroom, the mood was slightly less harmonious as Darla complained that Junie was being far too tense and resisting her cardio methods, which was making her arms tired from the effort. Junie felt a wave of guilt and apologized for his awkwardness, promising that he would try to be much stronger and more relaxed the next time they spent time together. Darla gave him one last teasing look and suggested that maybe he should just learn to do cardio with himself from now on, since he was clearly old enough to manage his own business. Junie was momentarily horrified at the idea of being left to his own after Darla teased him about handling cardio exercises himself, wondering how he would ever manage without her. She quickly laughed it off as a joke, which brought his racing heart back to a somewhat normal rhythm. She then noticed that he was still in a bit of a sussy state and playfully accused him of still wanting more attention. He scrambled to compose himself while denying everything, but Darla decided it was time to make her exit since the hour was growing late. Even when he offered to whip up a late-night snack to keep her there a little longer, she turned him down with a giggle about her waistline and headed toward the door. As they stepped out into the cool evening air of the balcony, the conversation took a much more interesting turn when Darla pointed out how sussy their current arrangement seemed to be. She noted with a smirk that she had been quite hands-on with him, while he had not been allowed to return the favor at all. Junie tried to be a gentleman by insisting that he was perfectly satisfied with her generosity, but Darla was not buying his humble act. She urged him to be completely honest about his hidden cardio desires, and even brought up her partner, Tae, who had free rein to be as affectionate as he liked. The realization of his own jealousy hit Junie as he slowly nodded in agreement, admitting that he did indeed want more. Darla leaned back and dropped a bombshell, confessing that she had already shared those types of cardio experiences with Tae, much like the activities currently happening in her father's apartment. Junie was left wondering exactly what that meant for him until she stepped back into his personal space with a knowing look. She looked him right in the eye and offered to reveal the secret of how he could finally have the same privileges as her partner, promising to show him exactly how he could have everything he wanted. Junie stood frozen and gulped nervously as he waited to hear exactly what he had to do to earn Darla's special favor. He was completely caught off guard when she suggested that the simplest way to win her heart was to defeat the school's most formidable bully in a physical confrontation. He stood there paralyzed with fear as she explained how she was only attracted to the strongest guys and that power was the only currency she accepted. Just as he began to panic about his own survival chances, Darla doubled over with laughter and admitted the whole thing was a cruel prank. She playfully pinched his cheeks and told him she could never actually expect her gentle childhood friend to hold his own in a real fight. Their awkward moment was suddenly interrupted by the arrival of the woman from the coffee shop who was making her way down the stairs. She smiled knowingly at their close proximity and voiced her suspicion that they were much more than just platonic friends. As she prepared to head back to her shop, Darla's mood shifted from playful to venomous in an instant. She began hurling sharp insults at the woman about her daily visits to the landlord and her questionable lifestyle. The blonde woman didn't back down and even teased that she might eventually become Darla's new mother, which only sent the teenager into a blind rage. After a heated exchange of words, the older woman sighed at the lack of respect from the younger generation and continued on her way while Darla stormed back inside and slammed the door with enough force to shake the walls. Junie was left standing alone with the blonde woman who looked at him with a sussy glint in her eyes. She walked up to him and called him a little troublemaker before reaching out to hand him a cardio cloth. She explained that she had worn this cardio cloth all day and suggested it would be the perfect companion for his sussy thoughts later that night. She laughed at his visible discomfort and warned him to make sure his mother never laid eyes on the gift. Before she finally disappeared down the stairs, she took a moment to ask if he was still making progress on the portrait he was drawing of her, and Junie could only manage a flustered nod in confirmation. The blonde woman left Junie with a final, playful warning, making it clear that the quality of his art would determine exactly how much of her he would get to see in the future. She waved a cheerful goodbye and encouraged him to enjoy his evening, leaving him standing on the stairs in a state of complete bewilderment. The scene soon shifted to the busy street outside her coffee shop, where she moved with effortless confidence on her scooter, while Junie sought refuge in the quiet intensity of his art class. He sat among his peers, squinting at his canvas and trying to channel his nervous energy into every stroke of his pencil. During a much-needed break on the school rooftop, he was surprised to find her there again, casually enjoying a moment to herself. She noticed his uniform and asked if he was taking formal art classes, quickly concluding that he must be quite talented. When she demanded a portrait of herself, Junie tried to downplay his skills by claiming he wasn't very good at all. She didn't accept his modesty for a second, arguing that his training surely made him better than most, and she promised to do something incredibly nice for him if he followed through. His mind immediately drifted into a vivid daydream where she sat beside him, offering a taste of her special coffee in a very sussy setting. Shaking off the vision, he gulped and asked when she wanted to start the project. She mentioned the need to sit down and pose properly before tossing her cigarette aside and heading off. She casually invited him to come over to her place whenever he found himself free, leaving him to stand there and process the overwhelming implications of her invitation. The thrill of the moment quickly turned into a very awkward and uncomfortable situation that he simply couldn't ignore. He found himself making a frantic dash through the school hallways, eventually bursting into the restroom while trying to convince himself that his sudden distress was just the result of eating way too much ice cream. He retreated into a stall to try and regain his composure, but his heart nearly stopped when he heard the door open and realized a girl had entered the room. He froze in place, deciding that the only logical plan was to remain silent and wait for her to leave so he could escape unnoticed. His luck went from bad to worse as he felt his name tag begin to wobble precariously on his shirt pocket. To his absolute horror, the golden tag slipped off and clattered onto the tile floor, sliding directly through the gap and into the clear view of the person in the next space. He stared at the empty spot on his chest in total shock, realizing that his identity had literally just been dropped at the feet of his new neighbor. The situation in the restroom had shifted from a minor inconvenience to a full-blown crisis as Junie watched his identity slide across the floor. He stood frozen in the stall and gulped with a sense of impending doom, while the realization hit him that his name tag was now in the possession of the person next door. His heart hammered against his ribs as he heard her pick up the metal tag and read his full name aloud with a tone of recognition. Realizing there was no way to explain his presence without looking like a total creep, he chose the only remaining option and bolted out of the restroom as fast as his legs would carry him. Back in the safety of his bedroom, the adrenaline began to fade only to be replaced by a crushing weight of anxiety. He sat huddled on the floor and tried to convince himself that a simple name tag wouldn't be enough for her to track him down. However, that optimistic thought vanished when he remembered that he was the only person in their entire apartment building who went to that specific high school. He clutched his head in frustration and wondered why on earth he had decided to take such a risky look in the first place. His mother called out from the other room to check on him, and he could only manage a muffled response that nothing was wrong, despite feeling like his social life was over. The next morning at school, Junie was a shell of his former self and sat at his desk in a complete daze of worry. While the rest of the class was nodding off and setting new records for the most students asleep during a lecture, his teacher was actually impressed by his apparent dedication. The instructor pointed him out as the only one truly paying attention, unaware that Junie's eyes were wide and blank because his brain was stuck on a loop of pure dread. He agonized over the possibility of her showing up at the school, unaware that his nightmare was already becoming a reality just a few hallways away. The peaceful atmosphere of the principal's office was shattered when the blonde neighbor made a grand and very loud entrance. Principal Joe was nearly knocked out of his chair as she slammed the door open without a hint of hesitation or respect for authority. She held up the golden name tag like a trophy and demanded that they produce Junie on immediately, loudly accusing the school of harboring total disgraces. Her arrival was anything but subtle, and she made it very clear that she wasn't leaving until she had a face-to-face confrontation with the boy who had dropped his ID at her feet. As the final bell rang and students began pouring out of the gates, Junie tried his best to blend into the crowd of gossiping classmates. He kept his head down as people around him talked about exams and television shows, but his attempt at invisibility was cut short by the roar of a scooter engine. The blonde neighbor pulled up right in front of him and shouted for him to come over, calling him out by his name and his artistic nickname for everyone to hear. The entire student body stopped in their tracks as they watched the strange and bold woman confront the quiet art student in the middle of the sidewalk. The air was thick with the sound of whispering as his classmates began to speculate wildly about their relationship. Some wondered if they were outing, while others laughed at the idea of her being his sister, and the pressure only mounted when he saw Darla and Tae watching from the sidelines. The woman ignored the audience and told him to stop trying to hide his face, since she had already seen his name on the tag. She instructed him to get on the scooter and warned him that she would throw him off the bike if he didn't behave himself during the ride. The wind whipped through Juni's hair, and the judgmental stares of his classmates felt like weights as the scooter roared away from the school gates. Tae and his friends were left standing in the dust, completely baffled as to how the neighborhood loser had managed to hitch a ride with such a striking and mysterious woman. Even Darla couldn't hide her growing irritation, watching the pair disappear into the distance, while her own social standing took an unexpectedly confusing hit. Once they reached a quieter spot near the coffee shop, the woman's playful demeanor vanished, replaced by the fiery lecture of a person who had just caught a high schooler peeking from under a bathroom stall. Juni could only clutch his head in a mix of physical and emotional pain as she pointed out the sheer recklessness of his actions. She reminded him that her primary host was a landlord who handed out evictions like candy, and one more wrong move could easily land Juni's entire family on the curb. She waved his name tag in his face like a piece of evidence at a high-stakes trial, making sure he understood just how close he had come to ruining everything over a single moment of curiosity. Eventually, she softened her tone and handed the golden tag back, advising him to spend more time with his textbooks and less time on the tile floors of public restrooms. She was willing to overlook his lapse in judgment on the condition that he never skipped another art class and delivered a portrait that truly captured her best angles. Juni was more than happy to agree to those terms, practically radiating relief as he realized his family wouldn't be homeless by morning. He decided to look at the whole ordeal as a very unconventional and highly stressful form of life education. Back in the studio, the transformation in Juni was nothing short of miraculous as he channeled all his lingering terror into artistic perfection. His teacher was genuinely stunned by the sudden leap in quality and wondered if the boy had been struck by a bolt of divine genius, or perhaps a very specific kind of motivation. Juni remained glued to his canvas long after the sun had set, and his classmates had gone home to talk about the latest television shows. When the instructor finally poked his head in to check on him well past 10 o'clock, Juni simply claimed he was making up for a week of lost practice. In reality, he was caught in a whirlwind of inspiration, carefully sketching every feature of his new neighbor, while his mind bounced between her image and the complicated history he shared with Darla. He labored over the lines with a focus that bordered on obsession, determined to earn the rewards she had promised. Little did he know that at that very moment, his muse was right back where she usually was, keeping the landlord in cardio company in the apartment next door. The night air over the apartment building was thick with tension and the unmistakable sounds of an incredibly loud cardio session. Inside his room, Juni sat at his desk, clutching his head in total desperation. With major exams scheduled for the following morning, he felt like he was losing a battle against the thin walls that offered no protection from the landlord's enthusiastic activities. He found himself wondering how an old man could possibly have that much cardio energy while he was struggling just to read a single page of his textbook. His frustration was complicated by the fact that he was currently using his sketchbook to capture every detail of the woman next door. The constant auditory reminders of her presence were pushing him to his absolute limit. He realized, with a mix of pride and sheer exhaustion, that he had already handled his own business 9 times that day, yet the persistent noise from the neighboring unit was practically daring him to go for a 10th round. He felt completely overwhelmed by the situation and wished for nothing more than a few minutes of blessed silence. The disturbance was radiating through the entire building, affecting every tenant in a different way. In one unit, a father lost his temper and shouted about the landlord's lack of shame and how his behavior had only worsened since becoming a widower. His wife quickly reached over to cover their young son's ears, though her primary concern was the father's own colorful language rather than the noises coming through the ceiling. Down at the street level, a family was finishing the process of packing their lives into a moving truck. The father spat on the ground and offered a final bitter wish that the landlord would suffer for his indifference, clearly relieved to be escaping the constant noise. In another apartment, a husband sat on his sofa, listening to the walls with a look of intense disbelief. He felt a sudden competitive urge, wanting to prove to his wife that he was just as cardio capable as the older man next door. He tried to initiate a quick cardio session of his own, but his performance was over almost as soon as it started. His wife was left feeling entirely unimpressed and sighed about how the expensive supplements she bought for his cardio stamina were a total waste of money. She pointed out that the landlord was still going strong on cardio exercises, while her own husband was already finished and looking pathetic. Back in his room, Junie was a shell of a human being. He remembered a common myth about how too much personal cardio could stunt a person's growth, but he decided that since he was already quite tall, he didn't have much to worry about. He was so physically and mentally drained that he just wanted to rest for a single day without any interruptions. His internal monologue was suddenly cut short when he heard the woman's voice echoing in the hallway as she said her goodbyes. Realizing his chance had arrived, Junie grabbed his sketchbook and bolted toward the door. He found the blonde woman leaning heavily against the brick wall near the stairs, looking completely spent. Her legs were visibly wobbling, and she seemed to be struggling just to keep her balance after such a long evening. When he called out to her, she looked up with a startled and weary expression. Junie proudly presented the sketchbook and explained that he had finished her portrait even without her having to pose for him. He was eager for her approval, but the woman simply closed her eyes and held up a hand to stop him. She looked like she was on the verge of collapsing and admitted that she was far too exhausted to even look at the drawing. She noted that he must have heard everything happening next door and made it very clear that she had absolutely no energy left for anything other than finding her way home to sleep. Hana decides that she needs a proper nap before she can give his artwork the attention it deserves and suggests he drop by her place around 10 that night. Before she disappears, she playfully calls him out for listening in on her earlier cardio session and suggests that he was likely keeping himself busy with cardio at the same time. Junie tries to save face by claiming a 10-day streak of not doing any cardio exercises, but she doesn't buy the act for a second and reminds him that the thin walls work in both directions. Junie is left standing alone in the moonlight, suddenly hit by the terrifying realization that he might have been making his own embarrassing noises without even knowing it. When the clock finally strikes 10, Junie makes his way to her unit and gives the door a nervous knock. Hana opens it while drying her hair with a towel, looking very relaxed in a simple white tank top. Junie is immediately thrown off balance by her casual appearance and the clear lack of sense. He starts to wonder if she is intentionally trying to test his focus or if she truly sees him as nothing more than a harmless kid. He tentatively offers to step away so she can get properly prepared, but she dismisses the concern entirely by explaining that she doesn't bother with such things at home and plans to be in bed shortly anyway. They head inside, where she takes a seat on the floor to examine the sketchbook. She admits that the portrait is surprisingly good for being drawn entirely from memory, and Junie tries to act cool by mentioning his talent for remembering faces. As he watches her look over his work, his mind begins to race with the idea that she might be tired of her usual company and is looking for a younger cardio partner like him. He feels a surge of confidence about having a significant experience that night, though he quickly starts to worry about whether the landlord will find out and kick his family onto the street. Just as he is preparing himself for a big sussy moment, Hana drops a bombshell by telling him that the drawing just isn't good enough. She asks if he remembers the famous scene from the movie Titanic, where the artist draws the girl in a very specific and sussy way. She makes it clear that she wants a portrait exactly like that, and tells him he still has a very long way to go before he reaches that level of skill. She instructs him to leave the current sketch behind so she can track his improvement and tells him it is time to go home so she can finally sleep. As Junie tries to make his exit, he finds himself moving in a very strange and awkward crawl to hide the evidence of his excitement. Hana spots his bizarre behavior and wonders what on earth he is doing on the floor. He sheepishly apologizes for his reaction and blames it on the fact that he is only 18, which only makes her laugh at how easily young men are affected by the simplest things. He promises to practice even more and do a better job next time before heading out into the night. Little does he know, Darla is standing on the balcony above, watching the entire exchange with a look of pure disgust as she wonders if her childhood friend has officially lost his mind. The morning began with a sense of quiet confidence as Darla focused on her reflection, humming a cheerful tune while carefully applying her makeup. She seemed to be in a particularly festive mood, making sure every detail of her appearance was perfect before finally deciding that she was ready to face the day. Her father sat nearby on the sofa, watching her with a mix of amusement and curiosity as he wondered what could possibly have his daughter acting so bright and bubbly so early in the day. Darla kept her reasons to herself as she prepared to head out, offering him a quick goodbye gesture that caught him completely by surprise. He jokingly wondered if she was only being so affectionate because she needed a bit of extra pocket money, but she simply laughed it off and assured him that she was doing just fine as she made her grand exit. Down in the apartment courtyard, Junie was already waiting and looking a bit anxious as he checked the time. He realized they were running incredibly late for their first class, yet his primary concern was still making things easier for Darla. He immediately reached out to take her heavy bag, and she accepted the gesture with the ease of someone who was used to being taken care of. They made their way toward the school together, with Darla leading the way with her usual confidence while Junie followed closely behind, looking a bit flustered by the morning heat. As they arrived at the school gates, it was clear that Darla's social standing was as high as ever, with a crowd of students rushing over to offer her enthusiastic greetings. The warm welcome was suddenly interrupted by a very frustrated teacher who seemed to have reached his limit with her constant tardiness. He waved his wooden pointer and demanded to know if the school was some kind of joke to her, insisting that she report to his office for a lecture later in the day. Instead of looking worried, Darla simply shifted into a different persona, reaching out to grab the teacher's arm with a look of pure innocence. She put on a convincing performance of a student who had been feeling unwell all morning, causing the once angry instructor to turn a bright shade of red. He became so flustered by her sudden proximity and her soft tone that his resolve completely crumbled, and he ended up advising her to simply focus on more exercise to improve her health instead of punishing her. Once the bell rang for the break, Darla and a group of her friends retreated to the boys' restroom to hide from the faculty. The room was thick with smoke, as several students stood around, laughing about how easily Darla had managed to manipulate the teacher. They marveled at her ability to make such a seasoned authority figure look like a total amateur, while Darla basked in the attention and noted that the teacher practically enjoyed the encounter. The group was so focused on their rule-breaking that they didn't care about anyone else, even turning away a student who genuinely needed to use the facilities by telling him to find a different bathroom elsewhere. The atmosphere in the crowded room shifted when Tae made his presence known, moving through the group with a cigarette in hand and his eyes fixed on Darla. He pulled her, reminding her that they had been officially together for 50 days and that such a milestone deserved a proper celebration. He showed no regard for their audience as he became very sussy. The other students watched the display with a mix of fascination and extreme awkwardness, feeling their own faces heat up as the couple continued their sussy behavior in the middle of the restroom. Darla finally realized that they were becoming a bit too much for the room and suggested they should stop since everyone was staring. The public display of the scene in the restroom started to feel a bit crowded for Darla, who noticed that every student in the room was staring at them with wide eyes. Tae was not about to let a little thing like an audience ruin his vibe, so he took charge by shouting at everyone to mind their own business and get lost. The group of onlookers quickly took the hint and cleared a path, allowing Tae to assert his dominance one last time by telling the other boys they were finally allowed to use their own bathroom. As they walked out into the hallway, Darla basked in the attention, truly believing that her social status made her the most important person in the entire school. However, that feeling of being on top of the world vanished the moment she caught sight of something that turned her mood completely sour. She arrived back at the apartment building in a state of quiet fury, slamming her front door with enough force to rattle the walls. Her thoughts were consumed by the idea of Junie spending time with their blonde neighbor, and she found the mere suggestion of them being together absolutely insulting. She felt a wave of betrayal wash over her as she paced her room, her eyes eventually landing on a large teddy bear sitting innocently on her bed. Her frustration finally boiled over, and she grabbed a pair of scissors from her desk with a look of pure determination. The poor stuffed animal became the target of her pent-up rage as she began a frantic and messy teardown, sending bits of white fluff flying in every direction. While her father remained fast asleep and snoring loudly in the next room, Darla continued her middle school-style tantrum until the teddy bear was nothing more than a pile of fabric on the floor. She sat there huffing and puffing, completely exhausted by her own outburst, but still feeling a deep sense of irritation toward everyone around her. By the time the next morning rolled around, Darla was already at the door, putting on her shoes and preparing to leave. Her father woke up with a massive yawn and offered to give her some pocket money for the day, only for her to reveal that she had already helped herself to his wallet while he was dreaming. Instead of being upset about the theft, he seemed genuinely impressed by her boldness and praised her for being such a resourceful daughter. Darla didn't stick around for the compliments, choosing instead to demand that he finally get rid of the woman from the coffee shop. She wondered how he could still stand having her around and suggested that it was time to find someone else to keep him company. Her father could only offer a sad and complicated smile, knowing that he couldn't simply do what she asked. He stood there, thinking about how much he truly relied on that company to get through the day. His mind drifted back to the somber atmosphere of his wife's funeral years ago, remembering the crushing weight of being left alone. The landlord's mind was often trapped in a somber loop, reliving the heavy atmosphere of his wife's funeral from years ago. He remembered kneeling in the quiet hall, surrounded by mourning relatives, as he wondered how he was supposed to navigate the world without his partner by his side. Even now, the memory of his daughter's tearful cries for her mother echoed in his head, making the present feel just as hollow as that day in the funeral parlor. He often sought comfort at the bottom of a green bottle, leaving a trail of empty glass across his table as he whispered into the silence of his lonely apartment. Darla had very little patience for her father's dramatic displays of grief, especially when she was trying to get through her own morning routine. She stood outside his bedroom door and knocked with a mix of irritation and concern, telling him that even she had managed to move on, and he should do the same. In her mind, his constant mourning felt like a total performance, because she remembered exactly how much he had played with her mother while she was still alive. She found it absolutely hypocritical that he would act like a devoted widower now, and she didn't hold back from telling him that his tears were far too late to mean anything. The landlord's obsession with his frequent visitor from the coffee shop actually started on a very blurry evening outside a local storefront. He had been sitting on a bench in a drunken daze when a woman he knew introduced him to the new girl who had just started working at the shop. The moment the landlord looked up and saw Hana, his heart nearly stopped because he was convinced he was looking at a younger version of his late wife. In his intoxicated state, he had lunged forward to grab her in a desperate hug, crying out for his honey, while the poor girl and her boss stood there in total shock at his sudden and sussy behavior. Back in the present, the tension between father and daughter reached a breaking point as Darla continued to criticize his choice in company. She eventually decided to drop a massive bombshell by telling him that his precious Hana was actually spending her late nights with Junie. She described seeing the young man leaving the woman's apartment and accused Hana of having a very questionable taste for guys who were young enough to be her own son. Darla expected her father to be outraged by the betrayal, but his reaction was the exact opposite of what she anticipated. Instead of being angry, the landlord looked genuinely impressed and even felt a strange sense of pride that the quiet boy next door was so capable. He let out a laugh and jokingly suggested that maybe he should just invite Junie over so they could all enjoy a massive group cardio session together. Darla was so disgusted by his lack of shame that she slammed the door and stormed out of the house, convinced that her father had officially lost every bit of his sanity. She marched toward the school in a cloud of fury, muttering about how the old man had completely lost his mind since she allowed him to start his cardio hobbies. When she ran into Junie on the stairs, he tried to be a good friend by asking if she had been fighting with her father again. Darla was in no mood for small talk and simply snapped at him to hurry up since they were already late for their morning lectures. Junie followed her in a confused silence, unaware that the day was about to get much worse. The peace of the school hallway was suddenly shattered when Tae appeared out of nowhere, delivering a heavy strike to Junie's head. Tae was determined to make a point by delivering a series of sharp slaps while demanding to know why Junie thought he could get away with upsetting someone as important as Darla. He mocked the idea of a mere tenant getting involved with the landlord's favorite visitor, reminding Junie that he really needed to learn his place in the social hierarchy. The crowd of students watching from the sidelines found the entire ordeal hilarious, even accusing Junie of intentionally bringing their neighbor to the school just to cause a scene. Despite the physical toll and the blood starting to show, Junie remained stubbornly on his feet, which only served to irritate Tae even more. Seeing that a few slaps weren't enough to finish the job, Tae decided it was time to step things up and deliver a much more serious approach. He lunged forward with a powerful punch that finally sent Junie crashing to the floor, leaving the onlookers to joke about whether the blow had been a bit too effective. Darla stood nearby with a cigarette in hand, watching the scene with an expression that was hard to read through the drifting smoke. Tae noticed her intense gaze and wondered aloud if she was actually feeling worried about the neighborhood loser, even offering to stop the display if she found it too difficult to watch. The suggestion caught Darla off guard and sent her heart into a frantic rhythm as she scrambled to maintain her cold exterior. She quickly dismissed the idea of being concerned for someone she considered a hopeless case, telling Tae that she couldn't care less and he was free to do whatever he pleased. However, she looked visibly flustered when Tae called her over to stand by his side, leaving her caught between her popular persona and the reality of the situation. As Junie lay on the ground, wiping the blood from his face, his mind drifted back to a painful memory that explained exactly why he wasn't fighting back, despite the humiliation. He remembered a morning at the apartment building when his mother was rushing down the stairs and accidentally bumped into Darla, causing a basket of laundry to spill everywhere. Even though his mother had been incredibly apologetic, Darla had reacted with total cruelty, delivering a sharp slap and mocking her for being so clumsy. Junie had wanted to explode with rage right then and there, but his mother had grabbed his arm and begged him to stay quiet. She reminded him that they were entirely dependent on the landlord's generosity, especially since his father was unable to work due to a hand injury. She pleaded with him to put the safety of the family above his own pride and never to pick a fight with Darla, no matter what she did. This heavy burden of responsibility felt far more painful than any strike from Tae, keeping Junie's spirit crushed as he struggled to find the strength to face the crowd once again. Darla could feel her heart thumping against her ribs as she finally moved toward Tae, dropping her cigarette and trying to keep her cool in front of the entire class. Tae watched her with a smug expression, clearly enjoying the way she looked in the morning light, before he decided to turn the classroom into a stage for his own brand of drama. He pulled her into a very public and very sussy position, making sure everyone saw exactly who was in charge of the social ladder. The other students weren't just observers anymore, but had turned into a cheering section for the spectacle, finding the bold display of affection absolutely thrilling. One of the boys in the back even tried to get a bit of his own sussiness going with a nearby girl, but his attempt was quickly shut down when she threatened to burn his lips with her cigarette if he didn't learn some boundaries. Despite the chaos around them, Tai was focused entirely on his audience of one, leaning in to whisper things that made Darla's face turn a deep shade of pink. Junie could only watch from his spot on the floor as Tai became even more hands-on, showing a total lack of concern for the rules or the people around them. Darla felt a wave of embarrassment wash over her and quietly suggested that maybe they should find somewhere a bit more private to continue their celebration. Tai wasn't about to let his moment of victory end so easily and told her to just stay still while he kept his eyes fixed on the boy he had just knocked down. The atmosphere became even heavier as Tai began to use his relationship with Darla as a weapon to crush what was left of Junie's spirit. He wondered aloud if the neighborhood loser was feeling a bit jealous of their arrangement, mocking the idea that anyone would ever choose a mere tenant over someone with his status. He made it very clear that while Junie might spend his nights having sussy daydreams about the landlord's daughter, Tai was the one living the reality whenever he wanted. Tai eventually turned the situation into a final power play, holding Darla while declaring that since he owned her heart, he essentially owned everything that belonged to her as well. He looked down at the battered art student and realized that he was now the owner, leaving Junie with no ground left to stand on. To finish the display, Tai asked for Darla's permission to be the one to handle Junie from now on, and she could only offer a weary and indifferent shrug as she let him take total control over her childhood friend's fate. Tai decided he wasn't quite finished with his performance and walked over to where Junie was still recovering on the floor. Without a hint of mercy, he delivered a final, heavy kick that left the art student completely incapacitated and gasping for air. Tai stood over him like a conquering hero, issuing a final stern warning that things would get much worse if Junie was ever seen with the blonde neighbor again. Darla watched the entire ordeal unfold with a look of visible unease, appearing caught between her popular persona and a lingering sense of discomfort as the group joked about the loser finally passing out. As the crowd prepared to leave for the evening, Tai noticed that Darla seemed a bit quieter than usual after the intense display in the hallway. He pulled aside his friend Jason, who happened to live just a few minutes away from Darla's place, and instructed him to act as a set of eyes on the neighborhood. Tai wanted a full report on whether Darla and Junie were behaving any differently when the school crowd wasn't watching, essentially turning Jason into a local spy for his own peace of mind. Later that evening, the group gathered at the Volcano Bar to celebrate their social standing with a round of drinks and loud music. Darla was clearly not in a festive mood, downing her shots with a somber expression that Tai found impossible to ignore. He eventually realized she was still bothered by the earlier incident, prompting Darla to admit that his public display of relationship had actually been quite scary and embarrassing for her. Tai offered a quick apology while explaining that his primary goal had been to ensure Junie felt completely humiliated in front of everyone. Darla eventually reached her limit with the stuffy atmosphere and headed off to find the restroom, clearly needing a moment of peace away from the loud group and Tai's constant attention. While the teenagers were busy with their social drama, the local coffee shop was buzzing with a very different kind of energy as the night progressed. The boss answered a call from the landlord and immediately instructed Hana to get ready for another visit to the apartment building next door. The other women in the shop couldn't help but feel a bit jealous, whispering among themselves about why the old man only ever requested Hana's specific services for his cardio sessions. While the social drama was heating up at the school, another high-intensity cardio session was reaching its peak in a different part of town. A man with glasses was giving it his absolute all, though his partners seemed much more interested in the clock than his actual cardio performance. Once the workout finally came to an end, the two women found themselves sitting on a quiet set of stairs, counting their meager earnings with a sense of total disappointment. They couldn't help but complain about the customers' lack of cardio stamina and how the physical toll of the job just wasn't matching the payout. Their conversation quickly turned to the subject of Hana and her exclusive relationship with the landlord next door. They were practically radiating jealousy over her steady income and the way she was treated like a priority. One of them noted that they couldn't really compete with a memory, realizing that Hana's only real secret was her uncanny resemblance to a woman who was no longer there. Meanwhile, Hana was having a somber moment of her own, quietly hoping that the phone wouldn't ring and that she could finally have a night to herself because she was feeling completely worn out. Little did she know, the landlord was having a major breakthrough while staring at his late wife's portrait in the quiet of his apartment. He realized that living in the past was only keeping him in a loop of sadness and that it was finally time to branch out and try something new. He decided that he had relied on Hana's familiar face for far too long and was ready to see what else the coffee shop had to offer. He picked up the phone and delivered a massive surprise to the shop's boss by explaining that he wanted someone completely different for his evening routine. He felt a sudden burst of confidence and decided to invite both of Hana's jealous coworkers over at once. The sudden change in the landlord's preferences caused quite a stir at the local coffee shop as the boss coordinated a new arrangement over the phone. She confirmed the request with a smile and immediately called over the two women who had been so vocal about their jealousy regarding Hana's exclusive schedule. The girls were more than ready for the challenge, feeling a surge of confidence as they prepared to head over to the apartment building. They were convinced that their youthful cardio energy would be enough to make the old man forget all about his usual routine, laughing about how easy it would be to win over a customer of his age. As they roared away on their scooter, they boasted about showing him exactly what he had been missing, and were certain he would never go back to his old habits once they were finished. Back in the quiet of the shop, the boss shared a moment of reflection with Hana while they watched the smoke drift from their cigarettes. It seemed the landlord had finally realized that clinging to the memory of his late wife was only holding him back, and finding a new distraction was the best way for him to move on. Hana felt a massive weight lift from her shoulders, admitting that she had been growing genuinely concerned when the man started suggesting she move into the apartment permanently. While the boss noted how difficult it must have been to manage such a specific and older customer for so long, Hana was quick to mention the significant rent discount that had made the whole ordeal worth her time. She found it funny that the man wouldn't just raise her rent overnight just because he was moving on to a new company. The conversation took a humorous turn as the boss wondered what on earth the landlord was thinking by asking for two younger women at once when he was nearly 70 years old. She even joked about the possibility of the poor man having a heart attack from the sudden increase in his evening cardio routine. Hana simply laughed off the concern and revealed that the landlord actually possessed far more cardio stamina than most of the younger guys she had encountered. She even playfully suggested that the boss should give him a try if she was curious, though the boss remained skeptical about his abilities. Hana eventually shook off her own daze and focused back on her work, preparing a delivery for a soldier staying at a nearby place. She noted that it had been quite a while since she had handled a new client as she grabbed the bag and headed out for the night. While things were settling down at the shop, a very nervous Jason was navigating the dark and empty hallways of the high school. He was grumbling to himself about the unfairness of the situation, realizing that the school at night was far more creepy than he had ever imagined. He couldn't understand why he was stuck playing the role of a midnight spy for Tae, especially since his target was just a neighborhood loser who had surely gone home hours ago. His annoyance turned into pure terror when he turned a corner and spotted Junie sprawled out on the cold tile floor like a discarded uniform. Jason froze in place, his mind immediately jumping to the worst possible conclusion about the boy's condition. He stood over the silent figure and realized that if Junie was actually dead after the beating he had received earlier, the entire group was going to be in massive trouble. In a state of frantic desperation, he reached out with his foot to deliver a sharp kick to Junie's leg. Jason stood over the motionless figure with his heart hammering against his ribs, terrified by the thought that the boy might actually be gone for good. When a low and very groggy sound finally escaped Junie's lips, Jason was so startled that he let out a frantic yelp and tumbled backward onto the cold tile floor. He realized with a mix of intense relief and growing fury that the neighborhood loser had simply been taking a very deep and poorly timed nap in the middle of the hallway. Jason felt like a complete fool for being so worried, and immediately began delivering a series of sharp smacks to Junie's head to vent his frustration. He was especially annoyed because he had been forced to come all the way back to the school at night just to check on someone he considered a total nuisance. When Junie instinctively tried to protect himself from the barrage, Jason grew even more irritated and demanded that he stop blocking the hits and just accept his punishment for causing such a scare. Across town at the Volcano Bar, the atmosphere was far more festive as Tae received the update over his phone. He found it absolutely hilarious that his target was still lingering in the school hallways hours later and shared the news with the rest of the group. They all laughed at the boy's apparent lack of common sense while Darla sat quietly by Tae's side, watching the display with an expression that remained difficult to read. Tae praised Jason for his detective work and went back to enjoying his drink, satisfied that the social hierarchy had been firmly maintained. Back at the school, Jason informed his friends that he would be joining them shortly once he dealt with the bloodstains on Junie's shirt. He hauled the wobbly student to his feet and mocked him for his inability to walk in a straight line, even wondering aloud if the boy was actually intoxicated. He grabbed Junie by the collar and suggested that a few more kicks might be the only way to get him moving properly. Junie could only offer a low and pained growl as he struggled to maintain his dignity while his nose continued to bleed. The night at the school took a messy turn as the sound of rushing water filled the quiet restroom where Junie was trying to wash the blood from his face. Jason decided that a heavy kick to the back was the best way to get his attention. Scolding the boy for using water on a fresh wound as if he were a medical expert, he stood over Junie and demanded that he hurry up and wipe off the evidence, completely ignoring the physical and emotional toll the day had taken on the art student. As Junie looked at his battered reflection in the mirror, his thoughts drifted toward Darla and the sheer frustration he felt over her lack of loyalty. He realized with a heavy heart that she must have shared his most sussy family secrets with the very people who were now making his life a nightmare. He even wondered if she truly believed the rumors about him and their neighbor, feeling a strange mix of guilt and defiance as he considered how much he enjoyed Hana's company. He tried to tell himself that his family might at least get a break on the rent after all the trouble he had endured, convincing himself that he had nothing to hide despite the complicated nature of his social life. The situation turned from annoying to explosive when Jason began mocking Juni's family background with a cruel smile. He mentioned how Darla had told the group about Juni's father being unable to work, laughing at the idea that being a loser was simply a trait passed down through the generations. This was the exact moment the quiet boy reached his breaking point. Juni's eyes lit up with a sudden and terrifying intensity that caught Jason completely off guard. Before the bully could even process the change in the atmosphere, Juni delivered a powerful punch that sent Jason tumbling backward across the tile floor. The years of staying silent and holding back finally gave way to a wave of pure adrenaline as Juni channeled all his pained energy into a series of heavy strikes. He ignored Jason's shocked cries and continued his frantic defense of his father's honor, making it very clear that certain lines were never meant to be crossed. Jason was left gasping for air and wondering how the neighborhood loser had suddenly become the most dangerous person in the room. While the school was filled with the sounds of a desperate brawl, Hana was busy navigating a very different kind of evening shift at a place near the station. She arrived with her delivery bag in hand, looking far more composed than the young soldier who was waiting for her inside the room. The young private was so accustomed to his military training that he could only respond with stiff, loud formality to even the simplest questions. Hana stirred a hot cup of coffee and found his rigid behavior quite funny, eventually telling him to drop the army act since they were in a much more relaxed setting. Hana tried her best to get the young soldier to settle down and lower his voice, noting how his constant shouting was making the small room feel quite crowded. The young man could only offer a muffled response as he sat there in a total daze, completely mesmerized by Hana's presence while she carefully prepared their drinks. He sat with perfect posture and couldn't help but think about how striking she looked in the soft light of the room, while Hana focused on stirring the coffee with a playful smile. When she finally handed him the mug, the soldier didn't even wait for the steam to clear before gulping the entire thing down in one go. Hana watched in pure shock, wondering how anyone could possibly enjoy a boiling hot beverage with that much intensity. He let out a satisfied sigh and claimed that it was the best drink he had ever tasted, despite Hana's internal realization that she had just served him a basic cup of instant coffee. A heavy silence eventually settled over the room as Hana began packing away her supplies, making the ticking of the clock feel incredibly loud. The soldier eventually gathered enough courage to speak up and asked about the total cost of the evening with a stutter that revealed his deep-seated nerves. Hana naturally assumed he was talking about the coffee delivery and mentioned a $10 fee, but the young man quickly clarified that he was interested in the price of her cardio services. She gave him a knowing look and realized that the quiet private had finally found his voice, which signaled a much more interesting shift in their arrangement. After a bit of time had passed, Hana emerged from the small bathroom while drying her hair with a pink towel, feeling far more refreshed and relaxed than she had earlier. She was surprised to find that the soldier hadn't moved an inch from his spot on the edge of the bed, still sitting in a rigid military stance that made her want to laugh. She stood there in the doorway and found it absolutely hilarious that he was still following army protocol, even while he was out of uniform and waiting for her. The young soldier finally gathered his courage and asked Hana for a very specific favor that made her look at him with a mix of surprise and amusement. She jokingly wondered if he was about to suggest something truly bizarre, but he quickly clarified that his heart actually belonged to a married superior officer. He wanted Hana to help him live out a fantasy by acting just like her. He reached for a folded military uniform and pleaded with her to put it on so they could begin their cardio session. Hana took the request in stride and soon emerged as a strict sergeant, standing tall in the camo jacket and cap while looking down at the nervous private with a newfound authority. Meanwhile, the heavy silence of the night hung over the school grounds as two very bruised students made their way toward the exit. Juni and Jason were both staggering from their recent confrontation, though Jason was clearly the one suffering from a wounded ego, along with his physical injuries. He eventually turned to Juni with a look of pure desperation and begged him to keep the details of their fight a total secret from everyone else at the school. Jason realized that his social reputation would be completely destroyed if anyone found out he had been beaten by the neighborhood loser, and he was even more terrified of how Tae would react if he discovered the truth. He pleaded with Juni to stay quiet for both of their sakes, even mentioning Juni's name as if that might build some form of mutual understanding after such a violent encounter. While the boys were navigating their uneasy truce, a phone began to ring in a quiet apartment where Juni's mother was busy with her evening chores. She answered the call, only to find Darla on the other end, who was currently crouching on the sidewalk with a cigarette in hand and a look of visible frustration. Darla wanted to know if Juni had made it back yet, and she felt a surge of irritation when Mrs. An confirmed that the house was still empty. The mother began to wonder if something had happened at school, or if there had been another fight with the popular crowd, but Darla simply snapped at her and ended the call in a fit of pique. She sat there in the dim streetlights and spat on the ground, clearly bothered by the realization that her childhood friend was no longer acting according to her expectations. Back at the room, the atmosphere had transformed into a high-intensity training camp as Hana became completely immersed in her role as a commanding officer. She stood over the young soldier with her hands on her hips, loudly demanding to know why a lowly private couldn't follow simple instructions or maintain his cardio stamina. She ordered him to move his legs and continue his exercises with a tone of authority that she had apparently picked up from watching far too much television. The soldier was gasping for air and realized far too late that this exercise was turning into a legitimate workout that he wasn't quite prepared for. Hana showed no mercy as she shouted about his lack of dedication, questioning how he could ever protect the country while he was struggling through another round of physical training. Hana was taking her role as a sergeant far too seriously as she kept the young private pinned to the floor as part of their intense training session. She questioned his dedication to the military while he let out a series of pained sounds and struggled to keep up with the demands of her makeshift boot camp. Just when the poor man thought things could not get any worse, another imaginary sergeant appeared to double the pressure and increase the volume of the commands. Hana encouraged him to think of his favorite superior officer to find the strength to continue, but the soldier looked like he was about to faint from the sheer exhaustion of her relentless coaching. Hana eventually realized that she might have pushed the scene a bit too far when she saw the look of pure terror in his eyes as he lay gasping for air on the floor. Back at the apartment building, a very different kind of struggle was unfolding as the landlord's visitor realized she had made a massive mistake by underestimating his cardio abilities. She was currently attempting to crawl across the floor in a desperate bid for freedom, while feeling shocked that a man of his age could possess such terrifying levels of cardio energy. She clawed at the wood with her fingernails and pleaded for mercy because she realized that he was not even close to being finished with his evening routine. Mr. Yu simply looked down at her with a stern expression and noted that it was rude to walk away from an elder before the session was officially over. He grabbed her by the ankle and dragged her back toward the center of the room with total determination to finish what they had started, regardless of her visible panic. The night air was soon filled with the sound of frantic footsteps. The two women from the coffee shop practically tumbled out of the apartment building in a state of total disarray. They were clutching their clothes and running as fast as their legs would carry them, as if they had just escaped a scene from a horror movie, rather than a simple house call. One of the women was crying as she accused her friend of trying to abandon her during their desperate retreat, while the other could only apologize through her own tears of fright. They scrambled away into the darkness and felt completely traumatized by the experience, as they regretted every jealous thought they had ever had about Hana's exclusive client. Up on his balcony, Mr. Yu stood in the moonlight and watched the two figures disappear into the distance with a smug and satisfied grin. He let out a low chuckle and realized that his experiment with the new company had been a total failure compared to the reliable cardio stamina of his usual partner. He leaned against the railing and felt a sense of pride in his own endurance, while concluding that Hana was the only one who truly knew how to handle his specific brand of enthusiasm. The morning sun at the school gates didn't seem to brighten the mood for Junie, who arrived looking like he had just lost a very one-sided wrestling match with a brick wall. His face was a chaotic map of scratches and bruises that made even the most distracted student stop and stare in total disbelief at his battered appearance. As he staggered toward his desk, he was quickly swarmed by a group of concerned female classmates who hovered over him with worried expressions and eyes wide with shock. They crowded around him and wondered aloud if he had been caught in yet another confrontation with Tae, or if he had simply found a new way to attract trouble. The level of sympathy reached a bit of an awkward peak when one of the girls decided that the best medicine for his injuries was a very close and personal hug, pressing his bruised face right into her shoulder with no regard for personal space. Junie felt a wave of embarrassment wash over him and tried to warn her about the risk of getting blood on her pristine uniform, but she simply waved the concern away by mentioning the spare clothes she kept in her locker for emergencies. The gentle atmosphere was shattered the moment Darla stepped into the room with her arms crossed and a look that could likely freeze a volcano. The group of girls immediately sensed the dangerous change in the air and scrambled to offer a nervous apology for being so close to her childhood friend. Darla was clearly not in the mood for excuses and decided to deliver a sharp lesson in social boundaries by delivering a stinging slap to the face of the first girl who dared to speak up. Junie was absolutely horrified by the display and instinctively grabbed Darla's arm, wondering if she had officially turned into a common thug overnight. Darla simply scoffed at his intervention and suggested that his injuries from the day before must have scrambled his brain if he truly thought he had the right to talk back to her. She wasn't finished making her point and reached out to grab another classmate by the hair, delivering another sharp slap as a final warning for everyone to think twice before speaking in her presence. After commanding Junie to follow her out of the room, she marched into the hallway while leaving a heavy trail of stunned silence behind her. Junie took a quick and frantic moment to offer a sincere apology to his crying classmates, feeling a deep sense of guilt that they were suffering just for trying to be kind to him. He bowed low in shame before dashing out into the corridor to catch up with Darla and apologize to her instead, hoping to keep the peace before things got even worse. Back in the classroom, the girls were left to nurse their stinging cheeks and process the realization that Darla had truly lost her mind ever since she started going out with the school's most popular bully. They were busy plotting Darla's social downfall. They whispered about how her power was entirely borrowed from her partner, noting that his habit of switching partners every couple of months meant her time at the top was rapidly running out. They were convinced she would be a lot less brave once she lost her popular protector, looking forward to the day she finally had to stand on her own 2 feet. Meanwhile, Junie was trying to process his own confusion as he stood with Darla in a much quieter corner of the school. His face was a mess of scrapes and bruises, yet his primary concern was still her behavior toward their classmates. He wondered why she had chosen to hit those girls when he was right there, and more than willing to take the blame for her frustration. He practically offered himself up as a human shield, thinking it would have been much easier for everyone if she had just focused her anger on him instead. Instead of a lecture, Darla responded with a sudden and very loud burst of tears that caught him completely off guard. She sobbed about how incredibly annoying he was, her tough persona crumbling into a display of pure emotional exhaustion. As she cried, her mind drifted back to the crushing grief of her mother's funeral, making her current frustration feel like a much heavier burden than it actually was. She looked at him through blurry eyes and admitted the real reason for her outburst was the sight of other girls being so hands-on with him. She declared with a mix of anger and desperation that she was the only one allowed to be that close to him, leaving Junie in a state of total shock. Hoping to calm the storm, Junie promised that he would never let another girl touch him again, making an exception only for her and his mother. While he made this vow, he couldn't help but have a brief, distracting thought about the woman from the coffee shop, though he kept that realization to himself. Darla wasn't finished with her list of grievances and brought up how much she hated seeing him spend time with their neighbor. She revealed that she had witnessed his late-night visits and their scooter ride in front of the school, which felt like a total betrayal of their bond. She could handle her father being distracted by the woman's company, but the thought of losing her childhood friend to someone like that was more than she could stand. She hid her face in her hands and claimed she was too terrified to stop the beating he had received from Tae, insisting she never expected things to get that violent. Junie didn't seem to have a single ounce of resentment in his body, and even knelt down on the ground to tie her shoelaces while she continued her dramatic monologue. He remained silent as she explained how even the distance between their apartment doors was starting to become a major problem for her partner's temper. Darla looked at Junie through her remaining tears and wondered if he had developed a deep hatred for her after everything that had happened. Junie didn't even look up from his task as he tied her shoelaces, noting that he certainly wouldn't be performing such a humble service if he held a grudge against her. He admitted that he had been a bit frustrated the previous night, but assured her that he felt perfectly fine now. He even went as far as to take the blame for the entire ordeal, apologizing for his own shortcomings and suggesting that he should have handled himself much better. Darla was moved by his gentle nature and reached out to pat his head with a look of genuine pity for her childhood friend. The mood shifted instantly when she took his hand, wondering if this was his very first time being with a girl. Junie's heart began to thud like a trapped drum as he realized exactly where his hand was resting. His mind immediately jumped to the most logical concern, which was whether this sudden moment meant he would have to go another round of physical training with Tae. Darla looked at him with a newfound intensity and explained that simply fighting back wouldn't be enough this time because he actually had to win. She leaned in enough for him to feel the weight of her words, and Junie felt a surge of adrenaline as he realized that victory was his only option. Just as the tension reached a breaking point, Darla pulled back with a playful smile and admitted she was only joking. She claimed she didn't want to risk losing her favorite friend again, and suggested that such bold moves weren't necessary between the two of them. They stood there in the quiet of the rooftop, unaware that their sussy moment had a very interested audience. Hidden behind the massive cooling units, Jason was crouching in the shadows with his heart racing. He had originally climbed up to the roof to deal with the crushing embarrassment of being beaten by the neighborhood loser, but he had just stumbled upon a scene that changed everything. He could hardly believe his luck and silently thanked the heavens for providing him with the ultimate piece of gossip. He realized that this discovery was exactly what he needed to get back into the good graces of the popular crowd. A few minutes later, the heavy atmosphere of the classroom was filled with the sound of students chatting about their morning lectures. The group of bullies was lounging at their desks, immediately bursting into laughter the moment they saw Jason's battered face. They assumed he had run into a group of real thugs while sending Junie home the night before and mocked him for his poor luck. Jason ignored their teasing and walked straight over to Tae, who was busy with a handheld game. He leaned in with a look of pure determination and announced that there was something incredibly important he needed to reveal. Tae looked up from his screen with a cold and sharp gaze. Jason stood before the class leader with a lump in his throat and a bead of sweat tracing a nervous path down his neck. He tried to gather his courage, but only managed a series of awkward stumbles and gulps that did little to impress the group. Ty was currently lounging with his feet on the desk and his attention firmly fixed on a handheld game, appearing entirely indifferent to the drama unfolding beside him. He eventually lost his patience with the stalling and demanded that Jason simply get to the point or stop wasting everyone's time. Jason pleaded for a moment of serious attention, hoping that his request for backup would be taken as a sign of loyalty. Tae's response was anything but supportive, as he tossed his game aside and stood up with a look of pure coldness. Without a word of warning, he delivered a heavy strike that sent Jason reeling across the room and onto his knees. Tae was absolutely disgusted by the idea that someone as low on the social ladder as Jason would dare to ask for a favor or consider them equals. The situation turned even more chaotic as Ty grabbed a nearby chair and began slamming it down with enough force to make the entire room shake. He shouted at the top of his lungs about Jason's audacity, making it clear that just hanging out near the popular group did not make them friends. He told Jason that if he had problems with thugs or anyone else, he should handle it himself or find a way to make it go away without involving those at the top. The rest of the students watched the display with a mix of amusement and secondary embarrassment, finding Jason's total lack of dignity to be the highlight of their morning. The bullies in the back were especially vocal, laughing about how pathetic it was for someone to get jumped after a simple trip home. They joked that if Jason had actually been beaten by a neighborhood loser like Junie, he probably shouldn't have bothered coming to school at all. Jason was left clutching his head in total misery, the weight of his social failure feeling much heavier than any physical blow. Eventually, Jason managed to stagger toward the restroom, looking more like a ghost than a student as he wobbled through the door. The room was already occupied by several students who stopped their conversations to stare at his battered and bleeding face. When they tried to show a bit of genuine concern or ask what had happened, Jason completely snapped under the pressure. He delivered a final, frantic shout that he was not like them and that his connection to the popular crowd meant they were not on the same level. He slammed the stall door shut with enough force to shake the tiles. Hidden away in the privacy of a restroom stall, Jason spent his time fuming and nursing his pride while cursing the person he once considered a leader. He realized that the popular group was headed by someone truly unstable, and that telling the truth about his recent defeat would have likely ended in a much more permanent tragedy for him. His thoughts quickly shifted from fear to a desperate need for revenge, as he realized that the humiliating treatment he received in front of the entire class was the final straw. He began to piece together a plan, while remembering the surprising scene he had witnessed between Darla and Junie on the school rooftop. He recalled how the two of them acted completely different when they thought no one was watching, showing a level of sussiness that went far beyond being just childhood friends. Jason realized that this secret was his golden ticket, and that blackmailing Darla with what he saw would give him total control over her actions. He felt a surge of sinister joy at the thought of finally getting what he wanted, concluding that his loyalty to the popular crowd was no longer worth the effort when he had such a powerful opportunity for himself. Back in the classroom, the atmosphere remained heavy as the class leader sat with his arms crossed and a look of total indifference toward his peers. His silence was interrupted by a nervous student who gathered just enough courage to ask for a way out of the social group reserved for the neighborhood losers. Tae did not appreciate the interruption or the request and delivered a swift kick that sent the boy tumbling across the tile floor. To make his point even clearer, he stepped on the student's glasses with a cold and calculated crunch, reminding everyone that they should be thankful just for the chance to be in his presence. He issued a final stern warning for everyone to keep their mouths shut about the events on the roof, making it very clear that the consequences for talking would be severe. As he sat back down, his mind drifted toward Darla and the growing realization that she was becoming more of a nuisance than she was worth. He quietly decided that it was finally time to find a way to get rid of her once and for all. As the sun set and the lights flickered on at the apartment building, the quiet of the night was once again interrupted by the landlord's legendary energy. Inside his unit, Mr. Yu was fully committed to another high-intensity cardio session with his frequent visitor from the coffee shop. Inside the landlord's unit, the atmosphere was surprisingly agreeable, as his frequent visitor mentioned she was perfectly fine with his wandering eye, provided he never actually left her side. She suggested that everyone needs a bit of variety to keep cardio sessions refreshing from time to time, but she had a very specific reward in mind for her flexibility. She admitted to having a growing interest in the young art student next door and wanted the landlord's blessing to do cardio with him once he was a bit older. Mr. Yu found the idea absolutely hilarious and seemed more than happy to agree to such a bizarre trade, convinced that his own cardio stamina was still the main attraction. Outside on the stairs, Junie was busy trying to block out the unmistakable sounds of the neighborhood workout echoing through the thin walls. He found Darla sitting on the railing, looking quite relaxed, as she complained about the sheer noise coming from her father's room. She wasted no time in questioning Junie's loyalty, wanting to know for certain if anything significant had happened during his late-night visit with the blonde neighbor. Junie stood his ground and explained that his motives were purely about self-preservation, as he only wanted to show off his drawing to keep the woman from sharing his sussy bathroom secrets. He sheepishly admitted that the constant auditory reminders of her presence had made him a bit curious, but he insisted his intentions were entirely innocent. Darla was not entirely convinced and issued a very stern warning that another visit to that apartment would result in a second round of heavy education from her partner. She declared that she wasn't about to let a neighbor steal away her oldest friend and reminded him that his family's housing security depended entirely on his willingness to stay by her side. She promised that if he remained a loyal companion and followed her instructions, he would never have to worry about rent or his parents' future again. She made it clear that as long as he stayed focused on her, he could live there for as long as he wanted. The serious moment took a bit of a sussy turn when Darla noticed that Junie was struggling to maintain eye contact, appearing much more interested in her than her lecture. She laughed at his visible discomfort and called him a total disgrace, while Junie could only offer the classic excuse of puberty, making his brain a bit foggy. Darla seemed to enjoy his flustered state and leaned in, demanding a promise of total obedience as she exerted her social power over him. She looked him in the eye and confirmed that he really did want to stay by her side, and Junie could only offer a silent, nervous nod in agreement. Little did they know, their private balcony chat was being captured by a very motivated Jason and his friend with a camera. Jason was practically radiating joy as he realized they finally had the perfect weapon to dismantle the social hierarchy. He explained to his companion that while they could never win a fair fight against someone like Tai, they could certainly cause a massive amount of chaos by exposing Darla's secret sussiness with the neighborhood loser. He envisioned a future where Darla would have no choice but to do exactly as they said, finding the idea of taking it out on the leader's girlfriend far more satisfying than any school lecture. He was certain that once they revealed the truth, her reputation would be completely ruined. Darla found herself in a rather awkward standoff when she crossed paths with the blonde neighbor who happened to be wandering through the unit with absolutely zero sense. While she tried to maintain a look of stern disapproval, she couldn't help but notice that the woman possessed a cardio physique that was honestly quite impressive. The neighbor greeted her with a casual wave and a smile, appearing completely unbothered by her own lack of attire, while admitting she had a feeling this uncomfortable meeting was bound to happen eventually. This indifference only fueled Darla's rage, leading her to demand that the woman remove her presence from sight immediately because she found the whole display to be utterly disgusting. The neighbor took the outburst in stride and pointed out the obvious fact that she had just finished a very thorough shower, but Darla wasn't interested in logic. She argued that no amount of scrubbing could ever remove the internal filth associated with the woman's questionable lifestyle and suggested that being born again was the only way she would ever truly be clean. The neighbor actually thanked Darla for the dramatic life advice and offered a cheeky parting shot about using that supposed filth to provide Darla with a new little brother in the very near future. This bold remark sent Darla into a blind fury as she watched the woman disappear behind a slamming door, leaving the teenager to fume in the hallway while the neighbor enjoyed the last laugh. As the night progressed, the blonde neighbor sat alone on the floor of her apartment with a green bottle and a cigarette to keep her company. She spent a quiet moment looking at the portrait Junie had drawn of her and began to wonder if the young man saw her as a real person or merely as a subject of his artistic curiosity. She realized that her image in the eyes of the neighbors was a far cry from the person she saw in the mirror, but she decided to wash away the somber thoughts with another drink. In a nearby room, Darla was trying to unwind by laying on her bed and marveling at the handsome actors in her favorite magazine. Her quiet evening was interrupted by the persistent ringing of her phone, and she was genuinely surprised to see Jason's name flashing on the screen. She wondered why someone she considered a total loser was calling her at such a late hour, especially since it was already well past 10 o'clock at night. Down at the street level, the atmosphere was much more calculated as Jason stood outside the apartment building with a smug grin and a group of 4 friends. The evening was winding down in the apartment when Darla's phone began to buzz with an unexpected call from Jason. She answered with a look of pure confusion, wondering what on earth he could want at such a late hour of the night. On the other end of the line, Jason looked like he had been through a literal blender, but he had a very sussy grin on his face that suggested he was feeling quite powerful. He insisted that there was something incredibly urgent they needed to discuss, which only made Darla more skeptical as she lounged comfortably on her bed. She voiced her irritation at the timing and wondered why he was bothering her when she was trying to relax. Jason remained adamant that this was a conversation that had to happen face to face and mentioned that he was already standing right outside her building. Darla looked out toward the window and saw the group of boys gathered in the dim light of the street below. She noted that Tai was nowhere to be found and wanted to know why their leader wasn't part of this midnight meeting. Jason explained that Tae had already gone home for the night and that they were currently working on a surprise event that he could never find out about. A smug look crossed Darla's face as she checked the calendar on her wall and realized that Tai's birthday was still a few weeks away. She concluded that the boys were simply being incredibly devoted followers and wanted to start planning the celebration early to stay in Tai's good graces. She felt a bit annoyed about having to put her clothes back on and leave her room, but the idea of being the center of a secret plan was far too tempting to pass up. Down at the street level, the atmosphere was far more sinister than Darla could have imagined. Jason was practically vibrating with sussy energy as he clutched a plastic bag filled with photographic evidence of the rooftop encounter between Darla and Junie. His friends were lounging around the brick walls and laughing, making very crude remarks about how much they were looking forward to this special midnight encounter. One of the boys even admitted to getting a bit too excited at the thought of what was about to happen once Darla arrived. Jason found it absolutely hilarious that she was walking right into their trap, especially since she seemed to think she was the one in total control. He whispered to the nervous kid in glasses that the landlord's daughter actually believed they were there to plan a birthday party. The silence of the night was suddenly broken by the sound of the heavy apartment door slamming shut as Darla finally made her grand exit. She stepped down the stairs in her casual house clothes and wondered why they had the audacity to show up without even giving her a proper heads up first. Jason looked up and made a very sussy comment to the group about the specific view as she approached them. Darla walked right into the middle of the circle with a confident and knowing smile, marveling at how dedicated they were to be planning a party so far in advance. Jason took a slow drag of his cigarette and looked at Darla with a mocking expression, noting that she clearly had no idea why she had been summoned to the street. Darla stood there with a puzzled look, unable to grasp the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Jason gestured to her casual cardio clothes and made a very bold comment about her supposed intentions for the night, which caused the entire group to erupt into hysterics. They found his audacity absolutely legendary, while Darla's face turned a deep shade of red with fury. She demanded to know if they had all lost their minds or if they were simply too intoxicated to realize who they were talking to. She wondered where they got the nerve to speak to her with such a total lack of respect and felt a surge of indignation. In a fit of rage, she reached into her back pocket and whipped out her phone, determined to get Tai on the line to handle these losers once and for all. Jason didn't look worried at all and calmly advised her against making that call. He explained that if the school leader found out the truth, the boys wouldn't be the ones in trouble, but Darla would be the one facing a very grim situation. To drive his point home, Jason held up the clear plastic bag and invited her to take a good look at his latest collection of memories. Darla peered at the images and felt her heart practically stop as she recognized the scene from the school rooftop. She stared at the photo of herself being sussy with Junie and felt a wave of pure terror wash over her. The group of boys began to hoot and holler, noting that they had never seen the confident landlord's daughter look so genuinely frightened before. They joked about her having the talent to be a dramatic actress because her expression of shock was so perfect. Jason leaned in and pointed out the sheer irony of her secret behavior. He noted how she treated Junie like a total outcast in front of the school crowd, yet allowed him to be so hands-on when they were alone. He wondered if the toughest guy in school would ever forgive her for playing him like a fool for the sake of the neighborhood loser. He made it clear that her reputation was now entirely in his hands and that she and Junie were essentially finished if this news got out. The encounter turned even more intense as Jason grabbed her shoulder and began to whisper about the possible consequences of her betrayal. He reminded her of Tae's notoriously short temper and suggested that the school leader might decide to leave a few permanent marks of his own as a reminder of her mistakes. He became even more aggressive to emphasize that she was no longer in a position to give orders. Jason merely laughed right in her face and noted that it was quite bold for someone who spent her sussy time with the school's biggest loser to suddenly act so precious. This realization left Darla shivering in the cool night air as she clutched herself and began to understand just how much trouble she was truly in. The group of boys closed in around her and mocked the idea that she still considered herself part of their social circle or even the school leader's girlfriend after what they had discovered. Jason toyed with his phone and suggested that maybe he should just give their leader a call right now to ensure her life at school was completely ruined by the following morning. The confident persona Darla usually wore had vanished entirely as she desperately pleaded for him to wait and listen to reason. Jason showed absolutely no mercy and delivered a sharp slap before grabbing her once again to make sure she understood who was now in charge of the situation. He laid out a very cold and calculated choice where they would keep her secret safe as long as she was willing to do whatever they wanted. He made it clear that the only other option was facing the wrath of their leader and becoming the most hated person in the entire school. The other boys laughed from the shadows and reminded her that there were plenty of people who would celebrate her downfall. Jason leaned in, whisper about her status as the school's queen bee, while making her feel even more trapped by the reality of her predicament. He pointed toward the student in glasses and noted that his parents were currently out of town, making his empty house the perfect place for them to continue their cardio evening with a few drinks. Just as Jason began to lead her away, the tense atmosphere was suddenly shattered by a loud and very angry voice from the darkness. The entire group stood frozen, in total shock, as they were called out for being a bunch of cowards. The bullies looked around in confusion and wondered who could possibly have the courage to confront them. The tense standoff in the street took a turn for the truly bizarre when a new figure appeared on the balcony above, momentarily stunning everyone into a silent stupor. Jason was so caught off guard that he actually dropped his cigarette in shock while staring up at the landlord, who had decided that clothes were strictly optional for his midnight security patrol. Mr. Yu looked down at the group with a gaze that could wither a cactus, appearing like a very round and very angry titan of justice. He didn't waste any time before launching into a high-volume lecture, demanding to know why a group of losers was bothering his daughter in the middle of the night. The bullies, who were usually so brave when picking on art students, suddenly found their courage evaporating faster than a puddle in July. Jason scrambled to find his manners, stumbling over his words as he tried to offer a very shaky apology to the man he had previously considered a total joke. Mr. Yu was particularly offended by Jason's appearance, pointing a trembling finger at him and expressing his absolute disgust that they shared the exact same hairstyle. The other boys in the group couldn't help but find this hilarious, whispering among themselves that the two looked like a very unfortunate father and son duo. Darla tried her best to salvage the situation by claiming the boys were just close friends who had a few jokes to share, but her father wasn't buying the act for a single second. He roared at everyone to get inside and stop the nonsense, eventually slamming his door with enough force to shake the entire apartment building. Even though the mood had been thoroughly ruined by the landlord's unexpected performance, Jason managed to keep his sussy grin. He noted with a hint of admiration that the old man was surprisingly full of charisma before deciding it was finally time to call it a night. He delivered one last parting threat to Darla, reminding her that her status as the school's queen bee was on the line and that he expected her to make the right choice by the following morning. Once the street was finally empty, the bravado Darla usually carried vanished as she retreated to the lonely quiet of her bedroom. She sat huddled on her bed, trembling with a mix of fear and cold as she stared at the incriminating photos Jason had left behind. The realization that she looked genuinely happy in the pictures with Junie made the situation feel completely hopeless, as it was a level of honesty she could never explain away to the popular crowd. She chewed her nails in a fit of pure anxiety, wondering if even transferring to a new school could save her from the social destruction that was about to unfold. The next morning at Chungbong High School felt like a countdown to disaster as the students gathered in their usual classrooms. Inside room 2-1, the popular group was already busy being loud and obnoxious, laughing about a pool table they had supposedly ruined during a recent outing. Tai was in his usual spot, acting like the undisputed king of the hallway with his arm draped possessively around Darla. While the boys around her continued their mindless chatter about trick shots and high scores, Darla remained a silent and stony observer, her mind clearly miles away as she waited for the other shoe to drop. Her worst fears were realized when Jason appeared in the doorway, wearing a smirk that suggested he was the new king of the hallway. He didn't even bother to be discreet, delivering a very public and humiliating gesture that left Darla's heart thudding against her ribs in total shock. As he walked away with his group of friends, laughing about how much he was looking forward to their meeting that night, Darla realized her social standing was hanging by a single, very fragile thread. She eventually managed to retreat to the quiet of the girls' restroom, seeking a moment of privacy to process the absolute disaster unfolding around her. Crouched inside a stall, she battled with the realization that telling the truth to Tae would only lead to a much more violent ending for her childhood friend. Her thoughts were a chaotic mess of frustration until she suddenly remembered their blonde neighbor, Hana. She began to wonder if the woman who had brought so much chaos to their building could actually be the savior her family needed, even if the thought made her feel a bit sick to her stomach. While Darla was busy navigating her social nightmare, a much more peaceful scene was taking place on the school rooftop as the sky transitioned into a deep sunset orange. Hana leaned against the railing and held out a small, old photograph of herself from her own high school days. She watched Junie's expression of total surprise as he realized the polished student in the picture was actually her from 8 years ago. Hana looked at the image with a sense of somber reflection, noting how much time had passed and how many of her old dreams had simply vanished into thin air. She even went as far as to claim that she felt quite unattractive in the present, clearly struggling with the way the years had changed her. Junie was not about to let her dwell on such negative thoughts and used his pencil to frame her against the horizon, insisting that she was far more beautiful now than she ever was as a student. He explained his artistic perspective, that a person's beauty is truly complete in the present, arguing that the woman standing before him was the most perfect subject he could ever hope to draw. Hana was visibly moved by his sincerity, laughing at how much of a charming little smooth talker her neighbor was becoming. She decided that a simple photograph would no longer do, and suggested that he should draw her live that evening, comparing the idea to the famous artistic scene from the movie Titanic. She offered him the possibility of a very significant reward if he did a good enough job, inviting him to her apartment for a late-night session that left Junie in a state of absolute bewilderment. The rooftop was bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, as Junie attempted a rather unique hand gesture that he clearly thought was cool. His confidence was short-lived as Hana erupted into a fit of hysterical laughter, leaving him to scratch his head in total embarrassment over his failed display of style. As they discussed their plans for the evening, Hana settled on 10 o'clock for their artistic session. She playfully wondered if his mother would have any objections to him being out so late, but Junie assured her that his impressive height was enough to prevent his mother from treating him like a child. He promised to arrive with the stealth of a shadow, giving only one quiet knock to avoid any unnecessary attention from the neighbors. Hana found it hilarious that he was so worried about being seen, especially since she already knew all about Darla's tearful demands for him to stay away from her apartment. She encouraged him to focus on his practice before they met up, eventually waving goodbye as she headed off to handle her own business. Junie was surprised to learn that the landlord was occupied with a hiking trip, meaning the apartment building would be unusually peaceful for the first time in a while. He watched the older man leading a group of hikers with an energy that seemed almost supernatural for his age, leaving Junie to wonder what kind of secret fuel the man was running on to maintain such incredible strength. The next morning, at school, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension as the students gathered for the day. Tae walked through the schoolyard with his arm draped possessively around Darla, completely unaware that Jason was trailing just a few steps behind with a predatory smirk. Jason made a subtle and unsettling gesture toward her that sent a jolt of pure terror through Darla, making her realize that her social safety was rapidly disappearing. Tae continued to mock Jason for his choice of companions, laughing about how losers always seem to stick together in their own little groups. He had no idea that Jason was counting down the hours until he could turn the social hierarchy upside down and take his revenge. The evening was a blur of flashing arcade lights and loud music as the group eventually moved to a karaoke room. While Tae was busy being the life of the party and showing off for his friends, Darla sat in a stony silence, feeling more like a ghost than a participant in the celebration. When the clock finally hit 10 and Tae decided to call it a night, he sent Darla off toward a taxi while heading home to get some rest himself. Jason realized that the universe was practically handing him a victory by getting their leader out of the way so early. He and his friends watched Tae disappear into the distance. Tae walked away into the night, completely unaware of the mutiny happening behind his back. Jason and his crew watched his retreating figure with a mix of mockery and faux admiration, noting how perfectly he fit the role of a tough guy who knew exactly when to exit the scene. They found the irony of the situation absolutely beautiful as they prepared to dismantle his world, starting with his own girlfriend. Jason wasted no time in asserting his newfound power, grabbing Darla with a grip that made her realize her status as queen was now purely conditional. He wore a scarred and sinister grin while telling her she had made a very wise choice by not fighting back. He mockingly promised to protect her dignity from the more awkward members of the group, provided she played along with his new set of rules. Darla was practically vibrating with anxiety as she looked for any way to escape her immediate fate. In a desperate bid to save herself, she suggested they find a much better location for their evening cardio session. She brought up the blonde waitress from the coffee shop, reminding them of the woman who had recently driven off with Junie on her scooter. She explained that the woman lived alone in a studio apartment owned by her father, making it the perfect spot for a group visit without any interruptions. To make the offer even more tempting, Darla began to hurl vicious insults at the neighbor she once merely found annoying. She described the woman in the most negative light possible, claiming she had a very specific and sussy preference for both old men and high school students. Darla even went as far as to claim that the woman was always asking for more young friends to visit her house for late-night drinks.